When we think of the Tudor era, it's easy to picture kings, queens, and glittering palaces. But outside the royal courts, life looked very different. Ordinary people battled filth, disease, and hardship on a daily basis. And for some, simply surviving meant taking on jobs so revolting, so dangerous, that most of us today would never dream of doing them. Imagine crawling into a cesspit to haul out human waste, or letting blood-sucking leeches cling to your skin so you could sell them to doctors. Picture yourself scrubbing blackened cauldrons in smoke-filled kitchens until your hands cracked and blistered, or stomping barefoot in tubs of stale urine for hours just to clean cloth. These weren't rare punishments or bizarre oddities, they were real, everyday occupations for the poorest Tudors. Today, we're uncovering 10 of the most horrifying jobs from Tudor England, the kinds of work that will make your daily commute, your inbox, or even your Monday morning meetings feel like pure luxury. 1. The Tudor gong farmer. When it comes to the worst jobs in history, the Tudor gong farmer surely takes the crown. Back then, gong meant human waste, and a farmer was simply the poor soul hired to deal with it. Their grim task? To climb down into cesspits, huge, reeking holes beneath Tudor houses and taverns, and shovel out years of raw sewage. They could only work at night. The stench was so overpowering that townsfolk complained if the job was done in daylight. Dressed in little more than rags, they descended into pits of human waste, rotting food, and whatever else people had thrown away. Imagine standing chest deep in filth, rats darting past your legs while every breath risked knocking you unconscious from poisonous fumes. Many never made it back out. Cesspits churned with deadly gases like methane and ammonia. One wrong inhale and a gong farmer could collapse instantly. Even those who survived carried the job with them long after they left the pit. The smell clung to their skin and clothes, impossible to wash away. People crossed the street to avoid them. They were indispensable, yet treated as untouchables. Oddly enough, the pay was good. Landlords and towns had no choice but to pay well for a job no one else would dare to do. But the cost was steep. Ruined health, constant exposure to disease, and a life spent on the margins of society. And the waste didn't just disappear. Gong farmers hauled it outside the city walls and dumped it in lay stalls, vast piles of rotting excrement that bred flies, rats, and plague. In cleaning the cities, they often created fresh disasters. So the next time you're stuck in traffic, buried in emails, or groaning about your office job, remember the gong farmer. Without them, Tudor towns would have drowned in their own filth. The next time you flush a toilet, take a moment to be grateful. Plumbing is nothing short of a miracle. 2. The Tudor rat catcher, vermin hunter. If you lived in Tudor England, rats weren't just an annoyance. They were a death sentence waiting to happen. These vermin spread disease, spoiled food, and invaded homes, taverns, and grain stores. When the scratching and squeaking grew too loud, there was only one person to call: the rat catcher. On the surface, it might sound like a straightforward job. In reality, it was one of the most dangerous roles in Tudor society. Armed with traps, dogs, ferrets, and sometimes nothing but their bare hands, rat catchers hunted through dark cellars, overflowing sewers, and shadowy corners of kitchens. Every catch was a gamble. One bite could mean infection, and one flea riding on the back of a rat could carry the bubonic plague. Rats thrived in Tudor towns, where food scraps piled up in filthy streets and overflowing cesspits provided the perfect breeding grounds. Clearing them out was like fighting a tide. A rat catcher might rid a house of dozens in one night, only to find it crawling with fresh vermin by morning. The battle never ended. Some rat catchers turned their grim work into a kind of showmanship, parading their kills through the streets and dangling limp rats by their tails to prove their skill. Others experimented with early poisons. But those concoctions were unpredictable, killing pets, livestock, and sometimes people as easily as they killed rats. The reputation of rat catchers was complicated. They were needed, but also feared. Handling diseased animals daily made people suspicious, as though the catcher himself carried the plague. Compared to today's pest control vans and protective gear, Tudor rat catching was brutal, filthy, and always life-threatening. Yet without them, Tudor towns would have drowned in vermin. So the next time you see a pest control truck roll by, remember the Tudor rat catcher, standing bare-handed against an army of plague.
3. The executioner, Tudor people killer. Few jobs in Tudor England carried as much fear or stigma as that of the executioner. Their duty was simple yet terrifying: to kill on command of the crown. Beheadings, hangings, burnings, and even the gruesome punishment of drawing and quartering all fell under their grim responsibilities. Execution wasn't just justice, it was theater. Crowds gathered at Tyburn or Tower Hill, eager to watch criminals, rebels, and sometimes nobles meet their end. At the center stood the executioner, axe or sword in hand, carrying out the monarch's will. But this role demanded more than brute strength. A beheading, for example, required precision. One clean strike was seen as merciful, while a clumsy swing brought not only agony for the victim, but public fury for the executioner. Some wore masks, both to shield their identities and to protect themselves from the curses of the condemned. Despite their importance, executioners lived as outcasts. People believed they were spiritually tainted by death. Few would share a meal with them, and many lived on the edge of towns, isolated and despised. Their payment was often just as grim, sometimes the clothes or possessions stripped from the dead. And though they embodied the king's justice, executioners were never safe. In times of upheaval, the man who once wielded the axe could easily find himself beneath it. Necessary but hated, the executioner was both feared and pitied, a shadowy reminder that Tudor justice was as bloody as it was final. 4. The tanner, living in the stench of death. If you wore leather shoes, gloves, or belts in Tudor England, you owed thanks to the tanner, though you likely wouldn't want to stand anywhere near one. Tanners turned raw animal hides into usable leather, but the process was foul beyond imagining. Fresh hides arrived crawling with fleas and stinking of blood. To remove the hair, workers soaked them in fats of lime, dog dung, and even urine. Then came the worst part, scraping the hides clean by hand. The stench was overwhelming, a choking mix of rot, ammonia, and decay. No wonder tanneries were built far from town. Even from a distance, the smell clung to clothes, skin, and homes. People crossed the street to avoid tanners, treating them like untouchables, despite depending on their work. The job also ate away at the body. Lime burned skin raw, cuts festered easily, and diseases spread in the filth of tanner yards, where flies swarmed and rats feasted on scraps of flesh. And yet leather was everywhere, in armor, saddles, shoes, bookbindings, even luxury goods for nobles. The entire Tudor world relied on tanners, but respect was never their wage. For them, every piece of leather came at the cost of health, dignity, and a life lived in stench. 5. The leech collector, Tudor medicine's blood supplier. In Tudor medicine, doctors believed that illness came from bad blood. The cure? Bleeding. And the most popular tool for the task was the leech. But someone had to supply them, and that task fell to the leech collector. Often women or children, collectors waded barefoot into marshes and stagnant ponds, letting the blood-sucking creatures latch onto their skin. Once the leeches swelled with blood, they peeled them off and tossed them into jars for sale to physicians and apothecaries. It was dangerous, miserable work. Hours spent standing in freezing water led to fevers, infections, and lasting illness.
Collectors often lost so much blood they fainted. The wounds left behind frequently festered, especially in the dirty swamp water. Collectors were poor, desperate, and rarely respected. They carried scars, smelled of swamp rot, and were seen as tainted by their trade. Yet demand for leeches never stopped. From noble households to village healers, everyone wanted them, even though they rarely cured anything. Ironically, while physicians prescribed, it was the collectors who suffered most. They bled not just for medicine, but for survival.
6. The scullion, the kitchen's lowest slave. In the bustling kitchens of Tudor castles and manors, cooks and bakers prepared lavish feasts, but at the very bottom of the hierarchy stood the scullion, usually a child, servant, or orphan with no other options. A scullion's job was not to cook, but to clean. From dawn until long past dark, they scrubbed greasy cauldrons, soot-blackened pans, and filthy floors. Smoke from roaring fires filled their lungs, while boiling water and spitting fat left burns across their arms. Injuries were common, but sympathy was not. They rose before the sun and worked until exhaustion dropped them where they stood, often sleeping on kitchen floors among ashes and scraps. Other servants looked down on them, masters barely noticed them, and their lives carried no chance of advancement. A scullion was replaceable, disposable, invisible. And yet without them, Tudor kitchens would collapse into filth and chaos. Behind every glittering banquet, behind the golden platters of roasted meats and spiced pies, were children and servants scrubbing themselves raw. The scullion's life was a reminder. Grandeur at the table came at the cost of sweat, scars, and suffering behind the scenes. 7. The fuller, stomping cloth in urine. Wool was the backbone of Tudor England's economy. Everyone, rich or poor, wore wool, but turning it into fine cloth required some of the most unpleasant work imaginable. At the heart of this process stood the fuller. Their job was to clean and thicken woven cloth. That might sound harmless until you learn how it was done. The cloth was soaked in vats filled with stale human urine, water, and sometimes clay. Then the fuller climbed in barefoot and stomped for hours, pressing and kneading until the fibers tightened. The stench was unbearable. Ammonia fumes from the urine scorched the lungs and nose, leaving fullers coughing and raw-throated. Their skin blistered and cracked from the constant soaking, and infections were rife. Even after leaving the vats, the smell clung to their skin and clothes, marking them out in public as men of filth. Yet their work was essential. Without fullers, Tudor cloth would remain greasy, flimsy, and unwearable. Court gowns, merchant cloaks, even soldiers' uniforms all depended on their stomping feet. Still, fullers were poorly paid, despised, and trapped in poverty. The next time you slip on a clean shirt, remember, in Tudor times, it might once have been trodden through a vat of urine by a fuller gasping for breath. 8. The plague-burier, with carrying death on his back. Few Tudor jobs were as terrifying as that of the plague-burier. When outbreaks swept through towns, bodies piled up faster than families could bury them. The grim duty of disposal fell to the poorest men, a role that all but guaranteed their own death. Plague-buriers roamed the streets with carts, prying corpses from locked houses where entire families had perished. Bodies swollen and blackened often crawled with fleas carrying the very plague that killed them. The stench when doors were opened after days was unbearable. Their carts trundled toward mass graves, plague pits, where dozens, sometimes hundreds of corpses were dumped at once. There was no ceremony, no dignity, just quick disposal to slow the spread. Society spat on the buriers, branding them cursed and unclean. Payment was meager, the risk immense. The work scarred the soul as much as the body. Night after night they buried neighbors, friends, sometimes their own kin, knowing they would likely join them soon. In truth, plague buriers were victims as much as workers. They saved towns from collapsing under the weight of death, yet lived despised and doomed, remembered only for their grim burden. 9. The chimney sweeper child in the flue.
Chimneys were a Tudor innovation, symbols of progress that warmed houses and castles. But keeping them clear was one of the deadliest jobs of the age, chimney sweeping. To clean soot and tar from narrow flues, small children were forced inside. Armed with brushes and scrapers, they wriggled through cramped brick passages, sometimes no wider than their shoulders. Inside was darkness, choking soot, and searing heat from the fireplaces below. Children scraped until their hands bled and their knees burned. Many suffocated, fell, or became stuck, dying in the very chimneys they were sent to clean. Those who survived rarely grew old. Soot inhalation scarred their lungs, and constant exposure led to disease and cancers later in life. Most sweepers were orphans or destitute children, earning pennies for deadly labor. Without them, Tudor hearths would have smoked and fires raged out of control. So when we picture glowing Tudor feasts by crackling fireplaces, we should remember the children who crawled through smoke-filled tombs to make that comfort possible. 10. The resurrectionist, digging up the dead. Tudor medicine was desperate for knowledge, but laws and religion made corpses for dissection nearly impossible to obtain. Enter the resurrectionist, the gravedigger of nightmares. By night they prowled churchyards, shoveling just enough soil to break open coffins and drag out fresh corpses for surgeons and barber surgeons. The fresher the body, the higher the price. It was filthy, dangerous work. Families sometimes guarded graves, and church officials patrolled with dogs and lanterns. If caught, resurrectionists faced savage beatings or death for sacrilege. Even if they escaped, townsfolk despised them as desecrators. Imagine hauling a corpse through the mud in silence, lungs filled with the stench of decay, all while fearing discovery. Payment was decent, but no coin could erase the stigma. Ironically, their grim thefts advanced medical science, helping surgeons learn anatomy. But in their own time, resurrectionists were hated and hunted, remembered not as pioneers, but as robbers of the dead. 11. The barber surgeon, blood, blades, and broken bones. In Tudor England, if you were poor and sick, you didn't see a doctor. You went to the barber surgeon, a man who could shave your beard, pull your tooth, and saw off your leg in the same sitting. Their shops were marked by the striped pole, symbolizing bloody bandages drying in the wind. Inside, the tools were terrifying: knives, saws, razors, hooks. With no anesthesia, surgery meant screams and agony. Survival was more luck than skill. Barber surgeons set broken bones, lanced boils, stitched wounds, and drained blood with knives or leeches to balance the humors. More often than not, their treatments worsened the illness, yet they were respected because they were all most people could afford. Imagine holding down a patient thrashing in pain while a saw bites through flesh and bone. Many barber surgeons learned by doing, which meant many patients paid with their lives. Behind every Tudor cure was a barber surgeon drenched in sweat and blood, working in an age where medicine was as brutal as the disease. 12. The alnager, inspector of cloth and enemy of weavers. The wool trade was England's pride, the foundation of its wealth. To protect quality, the crown appointed alnagers, officials tasked with inspecting every piece of cloth before it could be sold. Armed with measuring rods and metal stamps, alnagers checked length, width, and weave. If a cloth failed, it was slashed, burned, or confiscated. Imagine a weaver watching weeks of labor destroyed in moments. This made alnagers hated across the land. Weavers and merchants saw them as tyrants, and many alnagers were beaten or killed for enforcing the rules. Yet refusal meant punishment from the crown itself, fines, prison, or worse. Alnagers walked a dangerous line, despised by commoners, mistrusted by nobles, but bound to the king's law. Their work was lonely, perilous, and thankless. In Tudor England, being an alnager meant living with enemies on all sides, the weavers below, the crown above, and no safe ground in between.